Morning, Jess. Where am I?
Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see you. We have people with us in Zoom, and we have people with us on YouTube and on our live stream as well. And I am Rabbi Jessica Spitalnik-Mates, and we've been inside Israel with Israeli Voices for the month, which has been absolutely unbelievable. We started the month with the head of blood distribution at Magen David Adom, learning about their work, especially with COVID, with Dr. Eilat Shinar. The second week, we had former Mossad agent Avner Avraham with us talking about his work as a spy and what spying looks like during this time of Corona. Last week, we had from Israel and from Miami, looking at Israel and its graffiti with Gadi Ben Dov, who's a tour guide in Israel and actually a graffiti artist from Miami, Serge Toussaint. And I got to be honest, I love all of them, but I'm most excited about today. I love words and I love language. And there are certain texts that inspire me or I look to for inspiration. I love writing and reading. One of the texts I look to often if I want to write something beautiful or passionate is the eulogy that Princess Di's brother, the Earl of Spencer, gave after her passing. It is intense, beautiful language put together, strung so beautifully. And I'm always jealous of those people who are able to so effortlessly put words together so beautifully. But if you ever thought about how the words are put together, that's what today is about. I first learned about the Hebrew Language Academy in the late 90s when my dad handed me an article from the New York Times that talked about this institute in Israel this was the late 80s, I think, the article, this institute in Israel that had to take a 2,000-year-old language that had been used only in prayer, very little in speaking, and bring it to modern times. It talked about how the word chashmal, electricity, came from a biblical word for a ray of light around a king's throne. It talked about how things like rollerblades and tissues needed words. And it talked about that struggle to not adopt other language words, but have it, the origin be Hebrew. And at the time, this, which is so ubiquitous in our lives now, the telephone was relatively new. And in Israel, it was called the Pelephone, the wonder phone. Pele means miracle, or the miracle phone. And it was so useful in Israel because it was the time when there were a lot of bus bombings, and Israel was so useful to have its Pelephone, its wonder phones that were there. And so, and then one of my professors in rabbinical school, Yossi Leshem, actually was part of the Hebrew Academy as well. And so just always been fascinated. And so for our fourth voice in our series of 4 from Israel, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome with us today Professor Steve Fassberg, who is the director of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Institute of Jewish Studies, the Caspar Levius Chair in Ancient Semitic Languages. And I'll drop his bio in the chat so you can see more details for those who are on Facebook. He is the department chair for the Department of Hebrew Language at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And his research interests include Biblical Hebrew, the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Aramaic dialectology. I tried Aramaic for a week, Professor, it didn't work for me. Northwest Semitic and Semitic philology. And he has a whole beautiful list of publications. And I'm thrilled that he is here. It's nighttime in Israel, so he's taking time out of his evening with his family to be with us today. So we're actually going to watch a short video from the Hebrew Language Academy, and then we'll hand things over to Professor Fassberg. So we're going to cue up that video, and after that video, you'll meet the professor. Thank you, and thank Ross, our amazing producer, always doing a great job to making sure that we are getting everything out to you well and good.
Actually, Professor can share it.
Okay, so Professor, we're going to actually just remember to share sound as well. And we're going to watch a short video. There's subtitles, so look at the bottom of the screen to read that.
If you can, just go full screen.
Okay. 1 second. Yeah, once I start. Okay.
ברוכים הבאים zu der Akademie für der Hebräischer Sprach.
נשמע מוזר. תארו לעצמכם שזאת הייתה המציאות הלשונית בארצנו. הרי רק בזכות חזונם ופועלם של חלוצי העברית לפני 120 שנים ויותר, אנחנו היום חברה דוברת עברית. אליעזר בן יהודה וחבריו הקימו את ועד הלשון, לימדו עברית בעברית, הוציאו לאור עיתונים עבריים וסיגלו את לשוננו העברית לשמש בחיי היומיום. בהשראתם, האקדמיה ללשון העברית ממשיכה לפעול בשליחות העברית זה 60 שנה, ומתפעלת מהישגי העברית. ראו איזה פלא קורה כאן בישראל. כולם מדברים, שרים וכותבים בשפה אחת, בעברית, החזון הפך למציאות. במשך השנים הקמנו בארץ מפעלים לתפארת בכל תחומי החיים, מפעלים גדולים ומעוררי השתאות. אבל תודו שמפעל תחיית הלשון העברית יוצא דופן בתרומתו לתרבות העברית ולהקמת המדינה. הנה ציטוט מדברי ראש הממשלה הראשון, מי שפעל לייסוד האקדמיה, דוד בן גוריון. העברית היא המלט התרבותי, כשם שהארץ היא המלט החומרי לאומה המתחדשת. כולנו גאים בהישגי העברית והתרבות העברית בדורות האחרונים, אך עוד מלאכה רבה ומשימות חשובות לפנינו. הצטרפו אליי לסיור קצר באקדמיה ללשון העברית. נראה כיצד היא פועלת היום בעידן המידע, התקשורת והטכנולוגיה, וכיצד היא נוגעת בנו. חשבו על האקדמיה כעל מפעל מחקר ופיתוח. הנה כאן מימין מחלקת המחקר. ראשיתה של העברית לפני יותר מ3,000 שנים. וכאן במפעל המילון ההיסטורי, החוקרים עמלים על איסוף הספרות העברית לדורותיה, ועל עיבודה ושימורה לדורנו ולדורות הבאים. את תוצרי עבודתם תוכלו למצוא במרשתת. בשמאלכם מחלקת הפיתוח. כאן מייצרים כללים לשימוש תקין בשפה ושוקדים על חידושי מילים בעברית. מכאן יצאו מילים כגון סמליל, קדימון וצרופה. נשארתם ללא מילים. הפיתוחים האלה מקבלים תוקף במליאה, מועצת המנהלים של האקדמיה, שיושבים בה מיטב החוקרים והסופרים העבריים. חשוב לא פחות, המפעל שלנו מטפח את הקשר עם לקוחותיו, קהל דוברי העברית ואוהבי העברית בכל רחבי הארץ. כאן במחלקת ההשתלמויות מכינים ומפעילים השתלמויות וימי עיון ליחידים ולמוסדות, לתלמידים ולמורים, לאנשי מקצוע ולכל מי שמעוניין. בקומה העליונה נמצאת מחלקת השירות לציבור. אנשיה עונים בכל חודש על מאות שאלות בענייני לשון שאתם מפנים לאקדמיה. איך אומרים בעברית הצ'ופשיק של הקומקום? מחלקת ההפצה מעמידה את המידע לרשות הציבור כולו באמצעות האתרים במרשתת, דף הפייסבוק וגם יישומון, אפליקציה. ההוצאה לאור מפרסמת מחקרי לשון בדפוס. הנה הגענו לחדר הישיבות, כאן כבר חושבים על העתיד ומתכננים את פעילות האקדמיה בעשור הבא. היום מונחת על השולחן התוכנית הגדולה להקמת הקריה החדשה ללשון העברית. הקריה הזאת תכנס תחת קורת גג אחת את כל המחלקות של האקדמיה, ויוקם בה המוזיאון הלאומי ללשון העברית. כפי שאתם רואים, העשייה בעיצומה, והמחויבות של האקדמיה ללשון העברית מתמדת ורבת פנים. נפעל יחדיו כדי שגם הנכדים והנינים שלנו ישמרו על לשונם העברית, ויחיו בסביבה ובחברה עברית. אצלנו באקדמיה לא רק מדברים, אצלנו עושים. הצטרפו אלינו כי אין לנו שפה אחרת.
And as you stop that share, I just want to give kudos to a whole group of people who started with Cantor Lori at the beginning of the pandemic to learn Hebrew, who are still today meeting on a regular basis. We are hoping to start an additional Hebrew class this summer, because we have an adult B'nai Mitzvah program starting in a few months. But there's a group of people that every day, at the beginning of the pandemic, every day, and then now it's, I think, twice a week, and they're with us here in the Zoom room and on YouTube and our live stream as well. So special kudos to those. I think it's been transformative and in a lot of ways just a salve through this time. And that last line of the video is the perfect expression of the resonance of language in Judaism and in Israel, because there's a song, Ein li eretz acheret, I have no other land. And in a play on words, they say we have no other language. So like everything Jewish, there's a lot of innuendos and a lot of loadedness. So Professor Fassberg, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored and very excited to be with you in Florida. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, but I have never been further south than Charlottesville, Virginia, I'm embarrassed to say. So I'm excited to be in Florida for the first time. Let me tell you a bit about the history of the Hebrew language and of the history of the Academy of Hebrew Language, and feel free to interrupt me or ask a question at any point along the way. And towards the end, Rabbi Mates and I agreed that we would talk a bit about words for the upcoming holiday of Purim. Everything goes back to Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was born in near Vilna with the name Eliezer Perlman. He Hebraicized his name. The important date is 1881. In 1881, Ben Yehuda came to then Palestine. He immediately started newspapers and included in them lists of words, of new Hebrew words that he coined, that he created, because there was a severe problem, as Rabbi Mates said. Hebrew had not been a spoken language for several centuries. In fact, it hadn't been a spoken native language since about the 3rd century CE, the end of the Mishnaic period. And so there was a tremendous need to modernize the language, create new words. And Ben Yehuda harnessed himself to this goal. And he did it partly for Zionist reasons. Herzl was the great Zionist and the political Zionist, but Ben Yehuda saw that there was a need to unite all the Jews who would come to Palestine. There would be a need to unite them in one language, because there were Sephardi Jews who had lived in Palestine for generations. They spoke either a form of Arabic, or they spoke Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. There were Ashkenazi Jews who had been in Palestine, usually for less time, but they spoke Yiddish. There were Jews from North Africa who spoke a form of Judeo-Arabic, a special dialect the Jews used in North Africa. And Ben Yehuda saw that there had to be one unifying language, and that was going to be Hebrew. Anyway, in 1889, he set up with a few others in Jerusalem a society called Safa Brura, meaning clear language, and their goal was to revitalize Hebrew. That didn't work terribly well, the society. It collapsed after 2 years. Then in 1905, under the instigation of the Histadrut HaMorim, the Union of Teachers in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, Ben Yehuda, along with several others in Jerusalem, set up the Va'ad Lashon, or what was, I suppose in English, is called the Hebrew Language Committee. This Va'ad Lashon was a voluntary activity. It certainly was not supported by the Turks who ruled in Palestine until the British conquered it in 1919, nor was it supported by the British during the Mandate period. It was a group of authors, teachers, writers, educators who felt a burning need to vitalize the language and make it accessible for modern times. For instance, the teachers union said, when we teach gymnastics, physical education, we don't have Hebrew terminology. We don't have words. How do you say somersault? How do you say jumping jacks? All sorts of, there was no vocabulary. Why? Well, somersaults are not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Somersaults are not mentioned in the Mishnah. Somersaults are not mentioned in the Talmud. Somersaults are not mentioned in medieval Hebrew literature. Anyway, the Vad HaLashon, the Hebrew Language Committee, immediately started working on lists of words for physical education, for electricity, for plumbing, and countless other things. Now, this committee ran until the beginning of the War of Independence in 1948. I have to say that from the beginning, there was tension in this committee and tension between the committee members and other Hebrew-speaking Jews in Palestine. The tension was this. Many people outside of Jerusalem, particularly in the new city of Tel Aviv, thought that a group of learned people in Jerusalem shouldn't be sitting around a table making up words. They thought that Hebrew was being reborn, it was being used spontaneously, and that society should let the speakers of Hebrew go ahead and develop their own vocabulary and develop their own language. The Jerusalemites, the members of the committee, thought differently. They wanted to hurry things up. So they wanted to help speed the transition to a fully spoken Hebrew. And in the committee, there was an argument. There were several arguments. One argument was, how should they pronounce Hebrew? How should they pronounce modern Hebrew? Should it be the Ashkenazi pronunciation you're familiar with? Should it be the Sephardi pronunciation, which is different from the Ashkenazi pronunciation? And I should stress that there was no one standard Ashkenazi pronunciation. There were several different ones. Every Jewish community had a slightly different one, and the same is true for the Sephardim. Or should it be the Yemenite tradition pronunciation of Hebrew? Should it be the Iraqi pronunciation of Hebrew? There was a tremendous debate over this. In the end, a consensus was reached, and even though most of the members of the Hebrew Language Committee were of Ashkenazi origin, they felt that the Sephardi pronunciation of Hebrew, reading from the Siddur, reading from the prayer book, reading from the Bible, reading from the Mishnah, they thought it was purer. It was closer to the original pronunciation of Hebrew back in the old days, back in Palestine, when Jews were sovereign. Anyway, in the end, the Sephardi pronunciation won out. And but as a scholar, Shlomo Goitein, said in the 1940s, and I quote, Sephardi, the language, the pronunciation of Hebrew, he summarized it as Sephardi according to will, but Ashkenazi according to ability. Because these people couldn't master all of the Sephardi sounds like ayin or het, or sounds like Saul for tzadi, etc. That was one debate they had. Another debate they had was, the members of the committee, was, okay, we're going to create new words for Hebrew, right? We need a word for electricity, as Rabbi Mate said. We need a word for telephone. We need a word for automobile. We need a word for light bulb. We need a word for all sorts of things. How will we create them? First of all, they all agreed that first they would scour the Hebrew sources, meaning the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and also medieval Hebrew literature. They would scour it for any words that might be close in meaning, And if they found one, they would then give it new meaning. So Rabbi Mates mentioned electricity, chashmal. Here's another example I'm just throwing out. The word in modern Hebrew for pistol is an ekdach, a gun, an ekdach. This word occurs once in the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah, where it's a type of precious stone. Anyway, I won't go through the reasoning that led to them choosing ekdach. It was thought to be a hot stone. So like a pistol that sends off smoke and fire, they chose this. But when they could find a word in a source and they could bend its meaning, extend its meaning, they did. They all agreed upon. But what do you do if there's nothing in the Hebrew sources? And then they decided, okay, well, some of them thought, okay, we should go to Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a language closely related to Hebrew. It's existed side by side with Hebrew since about 1000 BCE, so for 3,000 years. At a certain point around the turn of the millennium, around the time of Jesus, Aramaic, in fact, became the lingua franca, the spoken language in the entire Middle East, including in Palestine. Jews adopted it. And as you know from prayers, there are prayers that are not in Hebrew, but they're actually in Aramaic, like the Kaddish. The Kaddish is in Aramaic. It's close to Hebrew. It sounds like Hebrew, but it's not quite Hebrew. Anyway, so these scholars said, we must go to Aramaic first because it's linguistically close to Hebrew. And they would mine Aramaic sources for words, particularly the Talmud. The Talmud has lots and lots of Aramaic in it. But that wasn't always enough. They also then turned to Arabic. Now, Arabic is the best attested of all the Semitic languages. It's got the largest vocabulary. It also has many more speakers than any other Semitic language. And certain members of the committee, like Ben Yehuda himself, said anything that is in Arabic that I can find in an Arabic dictionary is kosher. It's kosher for Hebrew. I can use it. And so he would take words and he would change the sound a little bit, but he would take the meaning of Arabic and he would create a Hebrew word. So for instance, the word for socks, garbaim, is actually an Arabic root that has been Hebraicized. And the list of Arabic words that entered Hebrew because of Ben Yehuda is legendary. Anyway, this led to terrible fights. You can imagine the importance of this. Should we steal from Aramaic or should we steal from Arabic? Or should we borrow, rather, and then adapt it to Hebrew? So that was up till the War of Independence, this Hebrew language committee. And spoken Hebrew underwent a tremendous revival during the British Mandate, because the British declared 3 languages for Palestine: English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And that gave a tremendous push. And the Hebrew Language Committee actually worked with the British in order to get as much Hebrew out, get signs in Hebrew, official papers in Hebrew. They were in Hebrew, Arabic, and in English. So that helped increase the spread of Hebrew. Anyway, we come to the War of Independence. The war ends in 1949. David Ben-Gurion, who was an amazing man, a real Renaissance man. Despite the troubles facing Israel in 1949, right? Not enough food, not enough arms, indefensible borders, mass immigration. He takes time out to decide that there has to be an Academy of Hebrew Language. The Hebrew language is important to unite us as a people. And so the government passes a law setting up the Academy of Hebrew Language. But it's only in 1953 that it actually gets set up. Why? Because there was a fight between Ben Gurion and his ministers and the members of the Hebrew Academy, most of whom were continuing from the previous Hebrew Language Committee. What was the fight over? The name, the word academy. In Hebrew, the Academy of Hebrew Language is called Ha'akademia Lalashon Ha'ivrit. Ha'akademia. Okay, you understand that word without any problem. Right? They took the word academy. Now, the word academy, or different forms of it, have been in Hebrew since about the 1500s. They've been used. Ben Gurion, who was a purist, thought, over my dead body, the most important institution for Hebrew should be called by a foreign name. In the end, the members of the new academy got their way because they said this is unlike anything else that is in Hebrew. There were lots of suggestions for native Hebrew words. For instance, midrash, a beit midrash, a house of studying, which was in use in Mishnaic and Talmudic times. But they wanted the academy to be seen and treated respectfully like other academies of language across the globe, like the French Academy. There are also academies of language at the time in Syria and in Egypt and in some other countries. In English-speaking countries, there never have been academies of language, right? English speakers are a stiff-necked people. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. But in Israel, the government thankfully viewed it as a very important and necessary step, and we're lucky they did it. Now, the academy was set up with three main purposes. They were given three goals in their charter. The first was to gather all Hebrew vocabulary from all the ages, meaning beginning with biblical Hebrew, then the Hebrew of the Mishnah, and the Hebrew in the Talmud. And then you have the Hebrew in medieval commentators to both the Bible and the Mishnah, people like Rashi, the famous Rashi, the most famous Hebrew commentator, or Ibn Ezra, or Kimchi, and to also investigate the Hebrew of the Renaissance period and of the Hebrew Renaissance period, the Hebrew Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, to gather together all the vocabulary, because apart from the study of biblical Hebrew, for which there were concordances and dictionaries written by Jews, written by Christians in the Middle Ages, there was no central book you could go to find the vocabulary of these later sources. And as part of this vocabulary, it was decided that the academy, perhaps its most important function actually, at least for academic bums like me, is to come up with a historical dictionary of the Hebrew language. Okay, not a Merriam-Webster dictionary, not a Funk and Wagnall's dictionary, but something along the lines of the Oxford English Dictionary, which is complete, it's massive. Now it's online, but at one time it was 21 big, small printed volumes. And the goal was to do the same for Hebrew and to make it accessible to the public. Now, work on the dictionary actually started in 1959. And it was one of the first dictionaries to be computerized. That is, right from the start, they did it on computers. These were, in the early 60s, computers were huge things. They're not the small laptops or desktops that we use today, but they would fill up an entire room or two rooms. But they started working on that, and work continues today. There are about 10, I think there are between 15 and 20 people who are employed to work on the dictionary. They have not yet gone through all the Hebrew sources and put them into the dictionary. There is a lot of Hebrew out there, especially from the older Midrashic, Talmudic times and medieval and even early modern, 18th and 19th centuries. Anyway, so work continues with that. And the third goal is the goal that always gets the most headlines. And that is the goal of guiding the development or the natural development of the Hebrew language. That is, the academy, because Hebrew hadn't been spoken for almost 2,000 years, it had been used. Jews continually wrote in Hebrew. Jews continually prayed in Hebrew. And if two Jews from different parts of the globe met, the chances are that they could only understand each other if they spoke Hebrew, the Hebrew they knew from the prayer book, the Hebrew they knew from the Bible. But yet, how are you going to make a natural development of the language? And so the function of the academy that gets the most attention is the creation of words, and also decisions about grammar. Should you say it like this, or should you say it like that? It's actually not as simple as you think, because there's a fundamental question that members fought over and still fight over a little bit, and that is biblical Hebrew, that is the Hebrew spoken in Palestine until about 70 CE, until the destruction of the Second Temple. Biblical Hebrew is one dialect of Hebrew. But the Hebrew of the Mishnah and the Talmud is a different dialect. It's not the same. If you know any modern Hebrew, actually, it'll be easier for you to understand the Mishnah than to understand biblical Hebrew, because modern Hebrew, to a certain extent, is based on Mishnaic Hebrew. But there was a debate. Do we revive the language? Do we insist on the grammar that you find in biblical Hebrew? Or do we insist on the grammar that the Jews used in Mishnaic Hebrew? And in the end, it was decided biblical here, Mishnaic there, but on the whole more Mishnaic than biblical. But even so, Mishnaic is a lot like biblical in many things. So even today, when there are meetings of the academy, people will argue, should we do it like this? Or should we do it like that? Or should we do it the way people are actually speaking on the street? Because there often is a big difference between what the academy says and how people speak. The difference being that concepts and gadgets and technological innovations enter Israel much faster than members of the committee get together and decide on Hebrew terms for them. So a word will come in and people will start using it. Whoever imports it will make it sound a little Hebrew, but he'll use the foreign term. And then the academy plays catch-up ball to try to turn it into Hebrew. Often it's because people will write to the academy and they will say that they want a Hebrew word. They don't want to use this foreign word. Let me just give you an example. Rabbi Maitz mentioned her telephone. I'll show you my iPhone, which is called an iPhone in Hebrew. Nowadays, it's the cell phone in general is called the cellulari, a cellular phone. You talk about your cellulari, or there's a Hebrew term which is also used. It's called a telephone. Okay, you can recognize that word. You see, the academy was not successful in getting rid of the word telephone. Telephone nayad. Nayad means portable. It can go from place to place. People will even just say hanayad, my portable. Anyway, a word which came in besides iPhone and iPod is what you call, in Florida, what you call text messaging or texts, okay? In standard Hebrew, if I were to go out on the street now, a little dark, there aren't a lot of people, but if I were to go out, they would talk about SMS. Now, SMS, Americans don't recognize that term because you use text messaging, but SMS is the European term. And I believe it's also the British term for short message service. But anyway, in colloquial Hebrew, if you want to say text me, you'll talk about SMS, and they make a verb out of the letters SMS. And in a minute or two, I'll show you some of these words that they're creating. Some of them actually are highly successful. Some of them have been tremendous flops. But you'll see a lot of words that actually made it. Now, let me just finish by saying, let me finish this part just by saying that the Academy has lots of committees, lots of subcommittees. There's the plenum, which is made up of all of the Academy members. There are between 15 and 23 full members of the Academy. They are chosen by the members of the Academy. It's not a democratic process by any means. They are either researchers of the Hebrew language, or they are novelists, authors, translators. We even have some media people. And so you have a plenum where we all meet. We also have advisory members. We have about 20 advisory members who meet with us. We have two permanent committees. One is the Committee for General Use. And that's usually a committee where they discuss so-and-so from Haifa wants to know, why isn't there a Hebrew word for snorkel? And so the committee will meet, that committee on general use, and they will bang their head against the wall trying to come up with something which will be like snorkel. They did. It didn't catch on. Snorkel is the Hebrew word for snorkel. There's also a committee for technical terms, and that committee reviews terms proposed by many smaller subcommittees that are very specialized. Once upon a time, I was a member of a committee on biological terms. Okay, this was initiated by biologists. They didn't want to use the Latin terms. They didn't want to use the English terms. They wanted Hebrew terms. There is a committee for medical terms initiated by doctors, where they've come up with many different terms, many of which have been successful and have been adopted by doctors and by hospitals. There is a committee on computers, a committee on law, legal terms. There are a committee on wine, all the various aspects of wine, wine tasting, types of wine, etc. These committees are interesting because they're made up of people from the profession. There's always someone from the profession who chairs the committee. Then there's a member or two of the Academy whose job is to sort of make sure that they're not going too far astray with their grammatical proposals. And there's a nice mix, and it's very interesting. And often the professionals on the committees will say, there's no way in this has to be the English term or the French term or the German term. There's no way in the world people in my profession will adopt this Hebrew word. The Academy members always say, look, we have to come up with a Hebrew term too, so we'll list both of them. We'll list the one that everyone uses, and we'll list our new word, and we'll hope that we're successful with it. It's a lot of fun. It's very funny also to see how people view it as life and death. Okay, what I'd like to do now, first of all, if you have any questions or anything you want to ask or say, please don't hesitate. But
And
I want to, okay.
Did anyone have a question, or you can unmute yourself either way before we go on? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Now, the Academy has put out a very nice little booklet here. It's called 60 Words, an Invitation to Take a Trip in Hebrew. Now, these are words that the Academy has proposed, voted on, and so they are officially the words in Hebrew, officially, okay? With a bit of luck, they might even be included in dictionaries. But I'm just going to go through some of them, and you can see them, and I'll point out some of the words which have made it, which have been accepted, and other words which haven't. Here's a word for a pylon, migdol. I don't even know if it's been accepted. I don't think I've ever said the word pylon before now. Here you see the word ma'agana. This is the word for marina. Okay, a very useful word in Florida, the marina. I don't know anyone who knows this term, okay? It's from the word for anchor. They took a Hebrew word meaning anchor, which you have in biblical Hebrew, and they created a noun of place from it, but I don't know anybody who knows. Now the next word here, 03 actually is used. Mitzpor is an observatory. It's a place where you can see birds and wildlife.
So the Hebrew word for bird is tzipor. So that
It's from the word sipor, right? Excellent. Yes, yes. Here's a word. The akva is the aquifer. Okay, so here they made a word which sounds like the word that's used internationally. Now, the next word is a huge success in the last decade or two. This is the word for recycling. How did they make the word for recycling? The word is mihzur. They took the verb chazar, which means to return, and they created another form out of it. Mihzur. This word is the only word used in Hebrew today. The next word, 06, nitur, is monitoring. It also is wildly successful. There are committees all the time to monitor this and to monitor that, and they use this word. This word, for instance, here they took an Aramaic root, which means to guard or to watch, and they created this word. Here's another word which is used a lot today. The word for sustainability. Okay, this is a new word. The Academy only discussed it recently in the last few years. Kayamut. They took an adjective meaning existing. Kayam. They added an ending which helps create abstract words, and they created this word, which is the word used today. Here's a funny example of over here, the word for a spare tire. Everybody says spare. Everybody says spare. The Hebrew Academy came up with galgal chiluf, which means literally a wheel of exchanging, a wheel of changing. Okay, nobody will know what you're talking about if you say that. You talk about a spare. I'll skip these two and I'll go here. There are two nice words here. One which made it big and one which failed miserably. The one that made it big is speed trap. Okay, those of you who have been to Israel know how wonderful the drivers in Israel are. They're a lot like the drivers in New York, but 10 times worse. Now, they took a word, a root, kaf mem nun, which means to hide or to be hidden. And from that, you created a word meaning a speed trap. This is the only word that's used in modern Hebrew. Now, number 13, they've got a funny word, neker. If you can read this underneath here, you find it's written puncher. Puncher. This tzadi here, it's got a little mark next to it. In modern Hebrew, that's how you indicate the ch sign, since there's no special letter. Anyway, puncher in modern Hebrew is the word for flat tire. Okay? They came up with a word for flat tire, a neker. Nobody knows it. Nobody knows it. Everybody calls it a puncher. Okay? It's a lovely word, puncher.
It's funny, probably like puncture, but no, you can't make that sound.
Right. So the punch,
Sure.
and your average Hebrew speaker will not relate it to the word puncture in English. He won't at all. It's a different word. You can even make a verb out of it, meaning to make a hole in something. It's a funny word because it even has expanded its meaning in colloquial Hebrew to mean anything that goes wrong. So a few years ago, I was supposed to meet a lawyer, and he didn't show. And I called him that evening and I said, "What happened? We had arranged to meet. Where were you?" He said, "I'm sorry, I had a puncture." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a spare tire?" He said, No, I just got held up in a meeting." So it's anything that prevents you from doing what you're supposed to do. Here's a word which is caught on very nicely, mivoah. It's related to the word from a root meaning to come, and it's used to mean a lobby. So a lobby of a hotel, a lobby of any building now is universally in Israel called a mivoah. I won't go into the other terms because I want to get to the terms for Purim in a second. Here, we're up to computers. A newsletter, igeret meida, it's made up of two words which are basically Aramaic. It means a letter of information, but people use it, igeret meida. Now, here's a very funny thing. It's called the Hechsein Nayad. That was the Academy decision. They translated disk on key. Now, I'm guessing that anyone who's listening and watching does not know the term disk on key. Okay? In Israel, they think disk on key is an American word. This is your flash drive. This is your USB flash drive. The inventors were an Israeli company. The flash drive inventors were an Israeli company, and they called it disk on key, but with a Hebrew pronunciation, disk on key. And but nobody in Hebrew will use Hechsein Nayad. They will call it a disk on key. Here's another tremendous failure, Yoman Reshet. Yoman is a diary. Reshet is a net. They use this for blog, a blog. Now, a blog is a shortening of web log. They dropped the w in English, blog. What's the Hebrew term that everybody uses? Blog. Nobody would know what you're talking about if you said Yoman Reshet. Okay, this word here, sorry.
I was going to ask, are there COVID words like words that have emerged out of the pandemic?
New words, well, let's see. COVID, in Hebrew, nobody says COVID, it's corona.
Corona. Okay.
It's corona, a pandemic. There's a Hebrew word that actually goes back to biblical Hebrew, a magefa.
Yeah.
So they talk about magefat ha-corona.
A plague, like the 10 plagues, right?
Yes. It's a word for vaccination.
What's that?
Chisun. Chisun. It's a word which its basic meaning is to make strong. That's the word for vaccination. I can't think of any other, no, I can't think of any other special terms that have arisen for it. This word is nice, mikuvan. this is caught on. Everyone uses it. It means online. What they did was they took a word meaning line, a kav. They mixed it up with a word meaning direction, kivun. They merged the two and they got mekuvan. Everybody uses it. Everybody uses it. And I'll just do two more. And here, mirshetet, internet. Now, if you ask your average person on the street what the internet is, he will tell you, internet. Everybody uses internet except for members of the Hebrew Academy. And sometimes members of, and sometimes broadcasters on radio and on television, because the Academy controls the language of the broadcasters in theory. That is, every radio channel and every television channel in theory has a language specialist. And so occasionally you may hear mirshetet on the radio or television, but your average person will not know. They took the word for net and they created the word internet. Now here's a nice word, partsufon. A partsuf in Hebrew is a face. My face is my partsuf. You know, those of you who know Yiddish obviously know the word ponim. It means the same thing as ponim, panim, face.
Isn't there a show where they had caricatures that was Partsufim? Is that there's
Yes, that's exactly from that.
Israeli
Exactly.
show where they make big like puppets of like famous Israelis, like government people. It's kind of like a Muppet show, but and Partsufim was the name.
It's
I
yes.
just mentioned too, language is so potent. Like Ben Yehuda, from what I've read, was like a little abusive to his wife and son because he forbid, when they were still living in Russia, he made them speak Hebrew there, and he
Yes.
was abusive a little bit to
Yeah.
them. Like it's a really, like mamash, a really potent thing, something very potent.
He was a fanatic, but without fanatics, you often don't get things started.
Kurtzel too.
Yes, Herzl too. So anyway, you're absolutely right. This partsufim, Muppets of Israeli politicians, a savage satire many years ago. Anyway, partsufon is the official name for, what's commonly called a smiley, an emoji or emoticon, but nobody uses it. Here, tsurufa is a new word which is caught on. It's an attachment that you attach to your email. The word next to it, a talkback.
Sorry, Professor, is that also like attachment? Can that be used human-wise, like when someone's attached to someone?
No.
Okay.
No, this word is only an attachment that you add to your email. It's from a verb which means to attach.
Samid is attachment, right? Like attached. Would that be samid? Like an attachment that.
Yes. Yeah, good. This word tkuvit, a talkback, nobody uses it. Nobody knows it. It's from a word meaning reaction or answer, teguva. In good standard colloquial Hebrew, you say talkback. And somebody who writes on a talkback is a talkbackist. Okay, let me just here go to the end and show you that not all is lost. Here's a few words which succeeded over the years and managed to displace words that you would have never thought that they were able to be dislodged. One is a ma'avrer, it's a fan. It used to be called a ventilator. A ventilator, nobody will say ventilator today. Ma'avrer is the standard word, the creation of the academy, from a word meaning air. It's, in fact, etymologically, it's the same word as air. Here's a dachpor. This is a bulldozer.
So when you open a door in Israel and you have to push it, it says dachuf on the door. So that root is there.
Right. Right, exactly. It's from two words, dachaf, to push, and chafar, meaning to dig. They took two verbs, put it together, dachpor. And now if you're talking about a building site, you use the word dachpor. They used to say bulldozer. But if you're talking about a person, in colloquial Hebrew, you still call him a bulldozer. But the instrument itself is a dachpor. Now, here's one that I remember when I came to Israel in 1981. People would talk about a passport, but they created a Hebrew word, darkon, which is based on the word for path or way. And now everybody uses darkon. 4 more terms.
The word derech. We just have a couple more minutes, so I just want to make sure you get to the Purim words.
Okay, so I'll do this very quickly. The word for taxi used to be taxi. Now there's a special Hebrew word, monit. The word for a prescription. It used to be called Rezept, as in German, a Rezept. Everyone now calls it a mirsham. And the word for battery used to be bateria. Everyone calls it a solala. Okay, now let me jump to Purim. Okay, I thought of a few words that are important for Purim and are interesting, and I thought I would just mention them. The first one is the word for the name of the holiday, Purim. Now, in the book of Esther, there is an etymology, an explanation of the name of Purim. It says because they cast a lot, they cast lots. Pur in Hebrew means a lot, L-O-T. But it's interesting, the word Purim actually has nothing to do with lots. It actually is the name of an old Persian festival that took place around the same time of year. So our name Purim is actually a Persian word. A very important word is Hamentashen. Let's talk about important things, Hamentashen. Now, Hamentashen, it's a nice word, Hamentashen. Okay, Yiddish from German. It actually it's a barbarization of the word Montashen, of poppy seed pockets, Hamentashen. And then they were somehow identified with the Mon part was identified with Man, which was identified with Haman, which became Hamentashen. In Hebrew, though, you talk about Oznei Haman, the ears of Haman. And that is because among Jews from Spain, originally from Spain and from Italy, they had a pastry, which was thinly rolled dough, which when rolled up was in the shape of an ear, sort of. And this made it into modern Hebrew as Oznei Haman. Let me just say, Grogger, those of you who, well, actually, I guess you won't be going to the synagogue to make noise every time you hear. Yeah, okay, but when you take your grogger or your grogger or however you call it, that actually has nothing to do with Hebrew at all. That probably is a Polish word, an origin that went into Yiddish. And when it comes to names, Achashverosh, the king, Vashti, the queen, and Haman, these all seem to be Persian names originally that have entered Hebrew. Any questions about any other words for Purim? I'd be happy to try and answer.
Our Purim
question.
YouTube and Facebook Live. If you have questions, unmute yourself or put it in the chat. As you're thinking, I remember a story. We had a professor in school, Stanley Dreyfus, who was an amazing professor. He was actually the son-in-law of Leo Beck. And he talked of, he and a student were translating some Rashi, and they spent an hour on a word, and the word was adieu. It was good. but it was written in Hebrew letters.
In Hebrew letters, yes.
What it was. So I'm always good. Like I'm pretty good at seeing other languages when I'm reading Hebrew.
Those are always the hardest words. When I was learning modern Hebrew, the hardest words were names, English names in Hebrew letters, or English words in Hebrew letters. They're always the hardest at first.
Do you have like the most recent word? You would say the Academy, or one?
The most recent word? Yeah, no, there was a word recently. We had a meeting just 2 weeks ago on Zoom, of course. And I'm trying to remember what was decided, but I can't.
That's okay. That's
It was, I think it was something related to camping, a term for camping.
because more people are spending time outside, probably. That's it. That's it. That's so interesting because the three standard, what's it called? This is like a funny thing about Hebrew. What's the three stand lamp that's also for like a fifth wheel, what we say in English, a primus. So this is how interesting Hebrew is, that there's something called a primus, which is I think I'm telling this right, a three stand lamp. And if you were like a fifth wheel, like if you were with a couple and an extra person, you're called a primus. And Shimon Peres and his wife, when the early like Israel was in all these Chalutzim, these pioneers, Shimon Peres and his wife and Shulamit Aloni, I'm a big Shulamit Aloni fan, all lived in one tent, wherever they were, like farming the land. And she was a primus. She was a fifth wheel, we call it in English.
Yes.
So all these great, and those of you, raise your hand if you're in the Hebrew, in Karen Laurie's Hebrew class. I know a lot of you here are, and a lot watching on Zoom and our live stream as well. Just the more you know, the more you want to know. That's how I found I'll tell you my favorite word in Hebrew, and then we'll end. Moach is brain, and mumche is a specialist. A brainiac is like the word in here. And I just do you have a favorite Hebrew word, actually, Professor?
A favorite Hebrew word? Ooh.
I stumped you.
You stumped me there.
Right,
I wasn't prepared for that question.
That's okay. So we're all on our quest for our favorite Hebrew word. We want to thank you again for being with us. Ross, our amazing producer, work on your Hebrew. We're having we'll have a new class starting again this summer. If you haven't been B'nai Mitzvah before, you can do adult B'nai Mitzvah. And there's all these just great opportunities. It only enhances your life, I could say. It improves, l'shaper, to improve. It improves your life. So, Professor, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. And Ross, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jessica?